So we've been talking about sexual selection, and I talked about competition within one sex, between members of one sex, that's intrasexual, and then choice exerted by members of one sex choosing mates of the other, that is intersexual selection. And you might have been wondering why intersexual selection happens in the first place. Why do female cardinals prefer the reddest males, or female frogs prefer male frogs that go ribbit ribbit the most loudly, um, or all of the amazing things that they do? Why should certain features be the target of intersexual selection? There's multiple hypotheses here, and they're not mutually exclusive. Um, there are seemingly well supported examples of all of these, and in some cases, mixtures of these. So we're not looking at competing hypotheses. The question is which one might apply in any given situation. Uh, we can look at selection favoring assortative versus dissortative mating, um, sometimes selection by direct benefit, the good genes hypothesis, pre-existing sensory bias, or something called runaway sexual selection. And let's look at those. Assortative mating is preference for mates that are similar to yourself. Negative assortative mating or dissortative mating is preference for mates that are different from yourself. To some extent, these probably operate very widely. Um, Bear in mind that the common definition of a species is populations that are capable of interbreeding. If you are in a population and you don't have a strong preference for your own species, you might mate with a different species, and in that case, you don't pass your genes on, because by the definition we commonly use, species can't interbreed. Although, as we'll see, that's a fuzzy definition, but we'll get to that after break. So individuals that choose mates that are too much unlike them may have lower probability of passing on their genes because they might end up mating with a different species entirely. So selection presumably favors mating within one's own species. On the other hand, dissortative mating is actually less common for some reason, but one reason why it might be favored would be inbreeding avoidance. If you mate with an individual that is too much like yourself, it might be your sister, okay, or brother, or whatever the case might be. And inbreeding in and of itself doesn't cause defective offspring, but it does increase homozygosity. And as we've seen, that can be a bad thing, because, certainly all humans, and I presume most other critters, uh, are carriers of recessive alleles that would have a very negative effect. So a couple of examples, and here's one. This is the Caribbean root weevil. And it was shown that in this case, males prefer large females. And in this case, it's because the larger the female, the more eggs she can lay. So a male that likes a large female is going to have more babies than a male that mates with a small female. So all males have that preference. Large males, however, beat up the small males and take their lunch money and stuff them into gym lockers, or whatever the equivalent is among Caribbean root weevils. And so the large males outcompete the small males, who are left with only the small females to mate with. That graph at the lower left is a graph of male size on the x-axis against female size on the right, in pairs of weevils. And you can see that the two are pretty positively correlated. So in that case, assortative mating is just the result of males having a preference and competition doing the rest. Another one that's got a slightly different spin is butterflies in the genus Heliconius, native to the Amazon. Amazing group of species for evolutionary studies. They're not only beautiful and distinctive, maybe I can talk more about this later, but classifying them is rotten hard because there's a lot of populations that are sort of, but not quite, but almost, but not entirely separate species. They are mimics. There are different species that can mimic each other. There's a lot going on in Heliconius butterflies. And these two, Heliconius erato subspecies serbia and Heliconius hemera, live in the Amazon forest in southern Ecuador. They can, in fact, hybridize and produce hybrid offspring, but they rarely do. They prefer mates of their own color pattern. This has been tested. They'll set out pinned specimens of a female of one species, and or they'll set out females of both species that are dead and pinned, and see which one a male goes for, and the male always goes for his own species. In the wild, only about 10% of the butterflies that you see in the zone where they occur together, fewer than 10% are going to be hybrids. The suggestion is that this may be because these have warning coloration. And predators very rapidly learn to recognize warning coloration patterns. The problem is hybrids don't have the patterns that predators recognize, which may make them likelier to be eaten. You've got a case of, I wish we had more time for this. This is called Mullerian mimicry, where you have a number of species that evolve similar warning patterns, such that if a predator eats one and gets sick, it learns to avoid all of the species that are mimicking each other. So Heliconius hemera looks like a number of other species that are all toxic, and if a predator eats one, it'll leave all of them alone. Heliconius erato, it's the same thing. Hybrids don't have the color patterns of either parent, which means that predators have not learned to avoid them. So any hemera that mates with an erato is going to have hybrid offspring that are less likely to survive because they're going to be a target for predators. So hemera that, like erato, get selected against because they don't have as many surviving kids. Erato that likes hemera gets selected against. And so there's selection against the hybrids, and that tends to maintain mechanisms that keep those two species from hybridizing. So that would be a case of assortative mating maintained by selection. Dissortative mating is more rare. There's one that's been found in the European corn borer. It's a moth. And in moths, they all tend to look alike, but sight is not moths' main way of perceiving the world, it's smell. And the two phenotypes of Astrinia nubilalis look the same, but they produce different pheromone blends. We don't really know why, but these moths mate assortively. If I said it was dissortative, I made an error. So type E mates with type E, type Z mates with type Z. Hybrids are rare, even though in this case, hybrids don't seem to be at a disadvantage. It's been a few years since I looked up this paper, but last I checked, we don't really know why assortative mating was taking place in corn borer moths. We just know that it is happening. I should look back into that and see if they found out more since 2007. Here's some dissortative mating. White-throated sparrows come in two types, one with white stripes and one with brown stripes. Pretty big difference that you can see. Interestingly, it's correlated with a chromosome inversion. If you look carefully, if you look at the chromosomes of the brown striped ones at the lower right, those two chromosomes look identical, and you can see the centromere is in the same place. If you look at the white striped, the allele for white stripes is dominant, but it's expressed because one of those chromosomes actually has an inversion. There's a whole piece of it that is reversed relative to the rest of it. And you can see that chromosome actually has the centromere in a different location. The one with the inversion, the centromere is almost exactly in the middle. It's a centric chromosome, whereas it's acentric in the other one. Anyway, this is dissortative mating because as many as 98% of the matings come between different color morphs. So that's very strong dissortative. Part of the reason is that the morphs don't only differ in color, they differ in behavior. Probably because that chromosome inversion affects multiple genes. It also tends to affect crossing over. Remember that in meiosis 1, the chromosomes pair up and they swap bits. Hopefully you remember that from your genetics classes. Yes, crossing over. Well, if two homologous chromosomes pair up and one of them has a piece that's been put in backwards, that piece can't recombine. Which means that if you have a chromosome inversion, you inherit all of that inverted block of chromosomes as a single unit, because you don't have crossing over in that area because the chromosomes can't pair up properly. And that means there's a whole bunch of genes that are linked to the genes on that inverted chromosome. That means white morphs are not only whiter, but they're more promiscuous and they're also more aggressive. White morphs outcompete tan morphs, but for some reason, white morphs prefer tan. So both white and tan sparrows prefer tan mates, but the white sparrows beat up the tans and take their mates, and that leaves the tans to mate only with the whites. There's also the fact that homozygous white morphs aren't very common. They're homozygous for a whole lot of alleles, and they seem to show reduced fitness. John, that's okay. Just don't do it again or I'll kill you. But that was a joke, by the way. Probably should not say that on anything that's going publicly on YouTube. Okay, right. Another reason why you might get certain traits that are selected for is because they provide a direct benefit to the choosy sex. I guess it could be the male sex sometimes, but the examples I'm aware of are all about direct benefits to the females. So what you've got there is a hanging fly in the class Mecoptera. We have these around here. I'm not enough of an insect person to say much about them. That's why we have Dr. Desord, of course. But a male, when it's time for him to mate, will catch a prey insect. Mecopterans are predators. And he'll snag an insect and give it to the female. She might refuse it, especially if it's too small. But if she accepts it, she'll start eating it. And while she's eating it, he will copulate with her. And their copulation can last up to 20 minutes. Now, I wish I had, I used to have a slide of the actual data, and I need to go dig up the original paper and find it because somebody actually took a bunch of hanging flies, watched them mate, and then would dunk couples into liquid nitrogen at 1 minute, 2 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and so on, and then would dissect them and estimate the amount of sperm that the male had transferred. And it turns out that it was linear. Um, the length of time spent copulation is directly linearly proportional to the amount of sperm that the male can transfer, up to about 20 minutes. So the longer the male can keep the female copulating, the more offspring he can have because the more sperm he can transfer. The longer the female eats, the better nourished the female is, and the more eggs that she can produce, and also the less likely that she's still going to be hungry for another male afterwards. So males that bring big insects to their females, males that bring big nuptial gifts, as they're called, are going to have more babies because they have time to transfer more sperm. The female will be able to produce more eggs because she's better nourished, and the less likely that the female will seek out mating with another male. And then it's to the female's advantage to prefer males that bring big nuptial gifts because the bigger gift they bring, the more food she gets. She mates or she chooses individuals that bring her the largest direct nutritional benefit. So in some cases, one sex might prefer certain traits because those traits are directly beneficial to the choosing individual. There's other cases where this doesn't happen at all. And in those, a very common scenario is what we call good genes. This is a stickleback. They're found in both in streams and rivers in both the North Atlantic and the North Pacific coasts of North America. Far as I know, we don't get them here. Called sticklebacks because you can see the male has little spines on his back. And you might notice that that male has red color on his belly. They've got very complex courtship and mating behaviors. The males actually build nests on the bottom of the streams or lakes that they live in. And once they've done that, they will try to attract females by doing what's called the head standing dance, basically swimming with their heads down, wiggling those bright red bellies for all to see. It's basically the fish equivalent of twerking. And females, will pick out the red belly that they like the most and swim down and lay eggs in that male's nest. And then the male fertilizes the eggs and fans them and takes care of them until they hatch. And a study in 2001 showed that the degree of redness of a male stickleback was inversely correlated with his offspring's parasite load. There are some parasites, and you veterans of parasitology last semester might remember these because we saw some in Arkansas. You might remember we went looking for black spot disease in local freshwater fish, and we did in fact find some. There's a number of parasites that produce black bumps on the skin, and that actually makes them easy to count. So on the x-axis, you've got the father's degree of redness. I'm not sure exactly what they did. That might be the fraction of surface area that was covered in red. And on the y-axis, you've got the percentage of offspring that are infected by a certain tapeworm. And you can see there's a pretty good negative correlation. Fathers that don't have much red have offspring that tend to get parasitized a lot. Fathers that have lots of red have healthier offspring. So sticklebacks can't think this through, but you can. If you're a female stickleback, if you prefer males that aren't red, your offspring are going to be sicker and probably fewer of them are going to survive. If you're a female that prefers the reddest males you can get, then your offspring are going to be healthier and more of them will survive. So if there are genes that influence your preference, some of those alleles are going to be preferentially passed on because the females that like red males are going to have more babies than the females that don't. And the general theme here seems to be that bright coloration is linked with low parasite levels in a number of species of birds and fish. In particular, coloration using carotenoid pigments, which are red, orange, and yellow. That's a Scottish grouse right there, popular bird for hunting, related to pheasants and partridge and things like that. And you can see that the male has absolutely gorgeous red eyebrows. And lady grouse love the males with the brightest eyebrows they can get. And an experiment from 2007 showed that if you reduced roundworm infestation in red grouse, carotenoid levels went up. The fewer parasites were present, the brighter the eyebrows got. So the likeliest hypothesis seems to be that carotenoids stimulate the immune system and they directly indicate how healthy a potential mate is. A mate with low carotenoids is going to have a stressed immune system, isn't going to be healthy, and that individual's offspring are likely to inherit a less effective immune system and be ill themselves. So that seems to be why that's a reasonable explanation for why, in a number of species, it's not just bright colors, it's reds and oranges and yellows. It's also why you should eat your carrots and tomatoes, by the way. They're good for you too. Even though we don't usually pick mates on the grounds of how orange they are. And that's a joke I'm not going to tell. Right. An Israeli biologist named Amos Zahavi proposed a kind of extension of this and suggested that the reason why some traits are sexually selected for is actually the same as the reason why they are hindrances to survival. Zahavi came to his conclusion working on little Middle Eastern songbirds called Arabian babblers, but it may work with other species as well. Here's a peacock with that enormous tail. Peacocks can, in fact, fly, but you would think that, first of all, having a brilliant blue body and enormous tail would make it easier for predators to spot you and would also make it harder for you to get away. If you have to drag around an enormous tail like that, and it's also a drain on resources, right? Those feathers are made of protein. It must have taken a lot of metabolic energy to create all of that keratin protein and grow all of those enormous feathers. So many male traits that are sexually selected would seem to be disadvantageous. According to the handicap hypothesis, that is exactly why they're selected. If a male has a disadvantage, but he still survives, that shows that he has to have very good genes otherwise. I always explain it like this. Imagine I was tailgating outside a University of Arkansas football game, and everybody is playing cornhole and grilling burgers and calling the hogs and yelling "Woo pig suey." Imagine that I painted my body white and orange and started strolling through the tailgating area singing Rocky Top. If anyone does not know, that's the song and the colors of the hated University of Tennessee. Now, in recent years, probably nobody would notice. They just all kind of close their eyes in despair because the football team has really not been very good. But in years when we've done very well, if I did that, I would probably end up stirring up an angry mob because, some things are all well and good, but you don't mess with SEC football. And if I did that, if I were to paint myself white and orange and start strolling through the Razorbacks tailgating area, picking a banjo and singing Rocky Top at the top of my lungs, and I survived, it would mean that I was either strong enough to fight off everybody, or fast enough to run away, or quick thinking enough to convince a mob of angry, drunken Razorbacks fans not to tear me limb from limb. So if I can get away with that, then either I must be extremely fast or extremely strong or extremely smart. But either way, it says something about me that I can engage in a behavior that actually draws unwilling attention and still come out of it. I must have high quality. This is sometimes compared to the principle in human sociology of compet- uh, conspicuous consumption. There's no earthly reason why anybody in this world needs a gold toilet. Getting one would only be extremely costly and not really be all that useful. There's nothing a golden toilet can actually do for your excretory experiences that a plain old porcelain throne can't do equally well. But if I come to somebody's house and I use the bathroom and I see he's got a golden toilet, that means, haha, I can throw money away on something utterly useless and I'm still richer than you. Doing something that makes no economic sense is a signal of very high wealth. That person has just sent me a signal that he is exceptionally wealthy. And it's not a signal that is easy to fake, assuming it's real gold. And the idea is the similar here. For a peacock to have an enormous tail like that and live under this handicap and still be able to survive to adulthood and mate must mean that Mr. Peacock has pretty damn good genes otherwise. So the idea is that some traits are sexually selected because they are unfakeable signals of overall good genes. Here's another one. Male Australian bowerbirds spend an enormous time building these shelters made out of brush called bowers. In some species, they can be up to 2 feet high, and the males will decorate them with anything shiny that they can find. Here, evidently, there's a lot of berries that are bright red and dark blue. They'll pick up bottle caps and trash and gum wrappers if they're available. They'll pick up pebbles. Anything shiny that the male finds will be brought to that bower. Here you've got a male bowerbird. You can see he's got a bright blue feather and below him a bright blue bottle cap, trying to attract the ladies. Females mate with males with the most attractive bowers. It's been proposed that this is an example of the handicap principle, because if a male can do something as utterly pointless as that, then he must have pretty good genes. He must be, very vigorous if he can go around and collect all of these things that he can't eat and won't use. There's some other factors that may be at work as well, and I don't believe this is definitive. This is still being studied as to whether this is a case of the handicap principle or not. And here we've got anoles and a proposal for why males have those dewlaps is hybridization avoidance. There is the one that lived in my backyard a lot, Anolis carolinensis. That's a male inflating his red dewlap with white scales on it, probably about 5 minutes before my dog would try to eat him. We do get these at least up into South Arkansas. I don't know how many of you have seen these before, but at least some of you might have had them in Meemaw's backyard or something like that. There's over 350 species of anole in Central America and the Caribbean. Many of them share the same habitats, and as we've already seen, males display to females with a dewlap and head bobbing dance. And different species of anole tend to have different dewlap patterns, especially if they're in the same habitat. So on the left, that's a male Anolis sagrii, the Cuban brown anole, which, by the way, has been introduced to North America. My sisters got them in New Orleans and actually kind of adopted a bunch during the quarantine. Her main source of emotional soothing was hanging out with Cuban brown anole in the backyard, which she named Fluffy. Fluffy, by the way, has her own Facebook page if anybody wants to follow Fluffy, the world's cutest brown anole. If not, it's okay. Anyway, Anolis mestriae on the right, you can see has got a very different dewlap pattern. They're both found in the same parts. They're both native to Western Cuba, and they're both found on lower tree trunks. And this is one thing that y'all are going to help me test, but it is suspected that species of anole on the same island, and especially if they're sharing the same habitat, tend to evolve very different dewlap patterns and different push-up rhythms. And the reason is, again, if you're a male and you mate with a female of a different species, you're not going to leave offspring. For that matter, if you're a female and your male is of a different species, your eggs are not going to get fertilized. So the idea is that males that can clearly signal, hey, I'm Anolis sagrii and I'm not Anolis mestrii, will leave more offspring than males that signal, hey, I'm a lizard. I could be sagrii, I could be mestrii. I like being a man of mystery. Those males are not going to leave many offspring if they can't clearly signal what species they are. And females won't have many offspring if they don't have a strong preference for their own species. So that's actually getting into what we saw in the heliconius butterflies. Although in that case, hybrids can survive, but hybrids have lower fitness because they don't have the right protective coloration patterns. Here, it is possible that hybrids would never be born at all, and that creates selection for like mating with like. Different species also show different head bobbing rhythms. The top graph for each one of these shows the position of the head against time, and the bottom shows the inflation of the dewlap. And you can see these three different species, which I think are all from the same part of Central America. I assume they have different dewlap colors, but they also have different dewlap inflation patterns. Anolis sericius kind of pulses it, Limifrons just holds it, and different rhythms of nodding the head. And so there we go again. Females that mate with the wrong species probably have decreased fitness. Females with strong preference for their own species are likelier to have surviving offspring. Males that can clearly signal, hey, I'm sagrii, or hey, I'm a carolinensis, those should also have increased fitness. And the result is that each species should evolve a distinctive display pattern. At least that's the idea. That's something that you might be able to look up, or you might be able to look at when you have done that part of the upcoming lab. Actually, there may be more to it than that too, because you might have noticed that those dewlap colors tend to have a lot of reds and oranges. And remember, those are correlated with immune system health. So males may not just be signaling, hey, I'm Anolis sagrii. They might be signaling, hey, I've got an incredible immune system and you'll have lots of healthy babies if you mate with me. So that could be operating as well. That may be why females prefer bright reds and yellows in many species, although not all. There are some that have like blue um, dewlaps, and I'm not sure what that means. Um, there also may be some of the handicap principally involved because males are pretty conspicuous to predators, like my dog when I was a kid. When they go out in public and they'll get right there on a fence board or a twig or someplace that's pretty obvious and inflate this brightly red colored thing and start nodding their heads up and down. It makes them more conspicuous to predators. And the handicap principle could be involved. Sorry. If you're a male and you go out in public and wave your dewlap in the breeze and you survive whatever predators come trying to eat you, then you probably have very good genes. You're probably fast and smart and the sort of male that any female would be lucky to get. So there could be handicap principle going on, hybridization avoidance, um, and good gene signaling all at once. They don't have to be exclusive. Some great experiments done beginning in the 80s by Alexandra Basolo at University of Nebraska looked at sexual selection in swordtail fish. That's a couple of them. The female is on the right. She's got a translucent tail fin that basically looks like a regular tail fin. The male is the one on the left, and if you look at his tail, you can see he's got this blue with a black rim extension kind of coming down right there. That's why these are called sword tails. The male has a sword. The sword, by the way, is not spiky. It's just more fin, and like all of the fin, it is flexible. The male can't use it to sting or anything like that. There you can see it a bit more clearly in this Xiphophorus helleri. That's a male green swordtail. Most of his fin is pretty typical for a fish that size, but right there he's got this golden sword sticking out. And again, it's flexible, it's not sharp, but in his species, in X. helleri, males have these long swords, females never do. And females prefer males with long swords. Right. But there are other species of genus Xiphophorus. This is Xiphophorus variatus, the platy fish. Incidentally, both X. helleri, the green swordtail, and X. variegatus, the platy fish, are popular aquarium fish. They're pretty easy to keep. And thanks to selective breeding, we have varieties of both species with lots of different colors. You can see these guys in any decently stocked aquarium store. You can find swordtails and platyfish with all kinds of colors. This is what a wild platy looks like. That's a male. You can tell because one of his fins is rolled up into a sperm transfer organ. Um, it's this thing right here. And he does not have a sword. Okay, Cameron's got platies in his fish tank. Yeah, they're pretty cool little fish. And platies don't have swords, but Dr. Basolo found that um, female platies still prefer mates that have swords. And she was able to demonstrate this with some beautiful experiments where she would take male platies and cut out little swords out of thin plastic film and stitch them onto um, platyfish tails and do various tests and worked out that it didn't really matter, what the color of the sword was. Female platies would always go for a visible sword, even though the males of their own species have never evolved swords. And now that's kind of weird. Why would a female sexually select a trait that the males of her species don't even have? Sorry, I was momentarily thinking we shouldn't anthropomorphize animals like this. But yeah, I was just thinking about a female platyfish singing a country western song about how she just can't be satisfied or something like that. Anyway, it turns out that it's nothing like that. Female Xiphophorus, all species, prefer males that are larger. They'll take a large male over a small male. The other thing is that they're not especially intelligent fish, brains the size of a pinhead. And females don't have very sophisticated ways of processing sensory information, which means that a sword makes a male fish look bigger. So she will go for a male with a sword, not because there's anything great about a sword, but just because a male with a sword has a longer overall length. And that's what she goes for, even if half the length of the body is just some extensions of the tail fin and not more actual fish at all. So in that case, the females seem to have inherited a pre-existing sensory bias. Why they would like large males, I'm not sure, but maybe it's because large males are healthier males. Maybe large males um, are likely to father healthier offspring or something like that. I don't really know. But in some species of Xiphophorus, the males have evidently evolved a way to look larger without actually being larger. Okay, right. The last one, runaway selection, is sexual selection for absolutely no detectable reason. And it was found about 15 odd years ago in the spotted cucumber beetle, Diabrotica undecipunctata. In this species, before mating, males stroke the females with their antennae. Suppose we have males that have some trait that varies. In the case of cucumber beetles, there are some males that are fast strokers and some males that are slow strokers. Suppose we have females that vary in their degree of preferences for the trait. Some females prefer slow stroking males, and some females prefer fast stroking males. And I'm getting a mental image of a cucumber beetle singing, I want a beetle with a slow hand. Some cucumber beetles like male beetles with a slow or slow antennae. I want a beetle with a slow antenna. Yeah, sorry. Right. Assume that the trait and the preference for the trait are both heritable. So females with a strong preference will choose males with an extreme trait. Females that strongly prefer fast stroking males will mate with them, and females that strongly prefer slow stroking males will mate with them. And the upshot is that over time, the genes for the trait and the genes for the preference become linked. They may not be physically linked on a chromosome, but they will behave as if they're linked because they will usually be inherited together. Right? If I'm a beetle, I might inherit fast stroking genes from daddy beetle and preference of fast stroking genes from mama beetle. I'll have both of those genes and I'll pass those genes on together. And so the genes for the trait and the genes for the preference act as if they are linked on the chromosome. If that happens, once the genes for the trait and the genes for the preference are occurring together in the same genomes, then anything, even a totally random event that happens to make one more common, will also cause the other to become more common. So let's say we have beetles that are fast or slow, and they inherit either fast or slow stroking, and they inherit the preference for either fast or slow stroking. Let's just say that some random event kills off half the slows. Okay, the fast strokers are going to have more offspring, but that means there'll be more beetles that are fast and more beetles that prefer the fast stroking. And because there are more females that prefer the fast stroking, they will mate with fast strokers and leave more offspring. And that means in the next generation, you'll have even more fast strokers that also prefer fast strokers. And if you're a slow stroker, it's going to be much harder to find a female that likes that because most of the females are going to be fast strokers. If you're a fast stroker, you have more females to choose from. And the process sort of starts rolling downhill, as it were. Anything that makes one become more common is going to make the other become more common. And then anything that makes the other become more common will make the first one become more common. And so any increase in a trait will drive an increase in the preference for that trait. And the increase in the preference for driving the trait will make the trait become more common, which makes the preference become even more common, which makes the trait become even more common, which makes the preference become even more common, which makes the trait become more common. You see what I mean? You have a runaway sexual selection. And in this case, the traits do not do anything at all. There is no benefit that the female gets from fast versus slow antennal stroking. They're not markers of genetic quality. There's no major difference that I know of in fitness between fast and slow stroking male cucumber beetles. The only benefit is that females that prefer whatever is sexy will tend to have sexy sons. Females that prefer fast stroking males will have lots of fast stroking male offspring. That's the only case in which you can really say this is beneficial. So this was worked out, okay, about 20 years ago. Female cucumber beetles prefer slow stroking males. That does nothing for the females. It does nothing, no benefit for the offspring. The difference is that fast stroking males have fast stroking sons, which females prefer to mate with. So if you are a slow stroking male, you're less likely to reproduce. If you do reproduce, your offspring are at a disadvantage because what all the females want is fast stroking males. So slow stroking males tend to get selected out, and there's no particular reason why other than this is the way it's worked out. That's runaway selection for you. And that's an aspect of Ronald Fisher's hypothesis called the sexy sons hypothesis. A female who picks a male that has a desirable trait will leave male offspring that are desirable. And it does not even matter what that trait is or whether it is beneficial. This has been claimed as an example of this. Whoops. I'm suddenly drawing a blank on the genus right there, but that is a Malaysian stalk-eyed fly, where the eyes are quite literally out on these enormous stalks. That trait's not particularly adaptive. There's been an awful lot of kind of neurological rerouting that they've had to evolve in order to do that. But it's another case where we have this association between a trait and a preference. Females that prefer long-stalked males mate with long-stalked males, and their offspring carry both the trait and the preference for the trait. They carry genes for both. And what has happened there is that because the trait and the preference are linked, a female that picks a long-stalked male will leave long-stalked male offspring and will also leave females that like long-stalked males as mates. And so anything that tips the balance between long and short-stalked flies will set off this runaway process where anything that makes one more common will make the other more common, until we end up with extreme phenotypes like this. So that's an aspect of Ronald Fisher's 1930s sexy sons hypothesis. And that is actually my last slide. So I'm going to stop the recording.